Why, hello there, everyone. Welcome to my review of the open beta test for Under Night In-Birth 2 Celes. And I predict that this might be my shortest video in terms of fighting game beta test reviews, because for one, even though this game is a numbered sequel, in reality, it is more so like a big update to the previous game. It is not trying to reinvent the wheel. It is not trying to fix what isn't broken, which might sound kind of underwhelming to some people, but for me personally, this is actually exactly what I wanted, because I already considered the previous version of Under Night to be a perfectly designed game, at least as far as fighting games can go. And so I really didn't want them to change much with it. The only thing that the game was really lacking significantly was rollback netcode, but I am happy to report that this is now the first time Under Night can be played with rollback, because Under Night 2 will be launching with rollback netcode, and that is what the purpose of the beta test was for, or at least I assume that's what the purpose of the beta test was, to test the rollback, right? I imagine that because this game is going to be the first Under Night game with rollback, that maybe this is going to be a lot of people's first Under Night game, in which case, if you are one of those people that is now interested in Under Night now that it is getting rollback, if you have any questions about the game, make sure you leave them in the comments and I will be happy to answer them. If you're a little bit confused looking at the gameplay, basically what makes this game so good is that it is the perfect balance of Street Fighter footsies and hyper anime craziness and KOF movement. So it is an anime fighting game. Well, aside from the visuals, just gameplay wise, it does tend to have a lot of things that anime fighters have. Because, for example, one of the buttons, the D button, because this game has A, B, C, D. It is a 4-button fighting game. So if you hit the D button in the air, you move forward, which is essentially an air dash. Even though you have a little bit of an arc, it's essentially this game's version of an air dash, okay? So you do have air dashing in it, which makes it feel like an anime fighting game. But you can also hit this button on the ground if you press forward and D, and you do the same kind of forward moving trajectory, but you do it from the ground. And that makes it similar to a short hop from King of Fighters. So you have multiple different angles by which you can attack your opponent from the air. And so it's like an anime fighter mixed with King of Fighters, right? And of course, you have a little bit of Street Fighter in there as well, not only because King of Fighters is kind of similar to Street Fighter, but a lot of the inputs are Street Fighter-y, and the game does have some Street Fighter neutral to it. My point is that it's the perfect balance of all these multiple different types of fighting game subgenres, at least in terms of 2D fighting game subgenres. But the thing that really makes Under Night stand out, in my opinion, something that is very underappreciated, is the grid gauge, the grid system. And if you are watching footage of Under Night, you might be wondering what the pink and blue squares are at the bottom middle of the screen. That is the grid gauge. What makes the grid gauge so interesting, what makes it such an impressive and unique part about Under Night, is that without explaining in too much detail, the grid gauge is essentially this game of tug of war. It's this invisible game of tug of war that you are having to play additionally on top of everything else in the game. So it's almost as if you are having to play two games at once. On one hand, you are having to play a fighting game, and on the other hand, you are having to play this meta game of a tug of war. So behind those pink and blue squares, you will also see this ring, and this ring fills up. It's essentially a timer, and it fills up after a set interval, right? So whenever this ring fills up after this set interval, the game will check who has more grid, and whoever has more grid will be rewarded with this powered up state called Vorpal state. And when you are in this Vorpal state, it gives you access to a lot of extra things, but most importantly, most significantly, being in Vorpal state gives you access to a mechanic called chain shift, which is essentially a Roman cancel. It is a little bit different than Roman cancel. There is some more nuance to it aside from it just being a Roman cancel, but I'm trying to speak in terms of things that people would understand if they want to compare it to other fighting games, right? So you essentially have to fight for Roman cancel privilege, essentially. And it's really fun because to fill up the grid gauge, there are multiple different ways to fill up the grid gauge, okay? But in general, basically, just keeping it simple, you can get the grid gauge to fill up just by playing well and by playing aggressively. And you can also just choose to hold down a button to manually charge it up yourself. But if you manually charge it up, you are obviously leaving yourself vulnerable and somebody could just run up and grab you or hit you. And if you take damage while you are trying to manually charge it up, the grid gauge will break, which means you don't have access to it at all. You can also do a shield, which is kind of like a push block. You can do a shield while blocking as a way to kind of be cheeky and get some grid gauge while defending, because like I said, in general, you get grid gauge by being offensive. But if you want to try to sneak in some grid gauge while being defensive, you can use the shield. But if you take any damage while shielding, that also breaks the grid gauge, so it's really risky. Like I said, you have to kind of be a little cheeky if you want to do that. But it's really fun. I definitely recommend you guys to look up videos that are actually dedicated to explaining the Under Night mechanics if this sounds interesting to you or if you want to get into Under Night. If there's enough demand for it, I could actually just make a video myself explaining it. But I just felt the need to bring that up a little bit to just bring up why Under Night is so cool. Because like I said, with this game, with Under Night 2 being the first Under Night game with rollback, I think maybe some people are going to be a little bit unfamiliar with what makes Under Night so special, because they might just glance at it and think it's just some anime-looking fighting game that has a niche audience, right? And so with the game not being too different compared to its last version, there aren't any big significant game design changes to talk about. It's not as if it's Tekken going from Tekken 7 to Tekken 8 with this whole new heat system, or Street Fighter 5 to Street Fighter 6 with the drive mechanics, right? Those things, in my opinion, it's necessitated some more explaining and evaluation, whereas in this case, there's not much to talk about. The only differences with the mechanics is that they tweaked some things to the grid gauge, and they also added a new mechanic. I'm not really exactly sure how it's supposed to be used. I don't know if they posted somewhere an explanation for this, but I could not find it. I only noticed this because before fighting other players online, I warmed up against a CPU opponent, and I saw that the CPU was doing this mechanic, and that's actually how I learned about it. Because when I actually fought real players, I rarely saw any actual humans use this mechanic. And what it is, as far as I can tell, it is a forward-moving evasive mechanic. You input it by doing 3D or down-forward D. And I never saw this happen, but I heard that it is guard cancelable. And so if you could guard cancel into this forward-moving evasive mechanic, I guess I could have tried it in a match, but I always forgot it was a thing because I never saw anybody using it, right? But in theory, if this actually is guard cancelable, then I imagine, assuming also that it is an evasive thing, I would imagine that it would end up performing similar to rolling in King of Fighters, because in King of Fighters, you can do a roll while guarding, and you guard cancel into the roll, and you could use it to get out of the corner for things like that. So I imagine that is what it's for. That's not really going to overhaul the game or the balance too much, so I'm not really going to talk or theorize too much about that. But also, aside from the actual minor game design changes, probably more exciting is that every character got new moves. And I didn't check out every character's new moves. I only checked out the new moves for Waldstein or Waldstein, because that is the character I played in the previous Under Night game. And honestly, I think just hearing from other people talking about their mains, I think Waldstein probably is changing not very significantly with these new moves, at least compared to some of the other characters that got maybe more game-changing new moves. Because in the case of Waldstein, he got two new things. I think every character got two new moves. I'm not exactly sure about that. Maybe some characters got one, maybe some characters got three, but it probably ranges from 1 to 3 if it's not just 2 for every character. But in terms of Waldstein, one of his new moves is this ground slam, which looks like an overhead, but it's not actually an overhead. But upon slamming the ground, it creates this shockwave, which is a full screen projectile. So I think they gave that to him to maybe contest some of his more polarizing matchups, such as Hilda or Batista, which I definitely welcome because fighting Hilda as Waldstein is not a very fun time. So it seems to be maybe a full screen punish. I don't really know if it would have any utility outside of that. It doesn't seem to have much combo ability. I'm sure you could try to weave it into your combo routes a little bit. I never really labbed it too much. I just wanted to see what it was, and it seemed, just based on first impressions, to not have much utility outside of using it in neutral. And his other new move, I don't even know if you would call this a new move, because it's actually just an extension, sort of, to his regular universal throw input. So this is not for any of his command grabs. This is for his universal throw input by pressing A and D at the same time. So instead of just pressing A and D at the same time to do his regular universal throw, you can hold the buttons and he will do more damage because after throwing them, he will body slam them a little bit. Not too dissimilar from the one throw that Zangief has in Street Fighter 6, because in Street Fighter 6, one of Zangief's throws is just the throw, right? But then you can hold the buttons for that same throw and he will do an elbow drop on them. But the weird part is that in Street Fighter 6, the whole purpose of this is so that way you can get the extra damage at the cost of Oki, right? That makes sense. That would be the trade-off. In Street Fighter 6's case, you would choose, do I want better Oki, or do I hold the buttons to squeeze out a little bit of extra damage? In most cases, it's better to go for the Oki, and holding the buttons for the extra damage is really just there if it's to close out a round, right? So you have to calculate if the opponent has just a little bit of HP remaining, if that extra bit of damage from holding the buttons would finish them off, and that's what makes it fun in Street Fighter 6's case. But the weird part is that in Under Night's case, when Waldstein holds down the buttons to do the follow-up body slam to his throw, yes, it does more damage, right? As you would expect if this is supposed to be similar to Zangief's throw in Street Fighter 6, but it also gives him better Oki. So it seems to be objectively better than his regular throw. So I don't really know why exactly you would ever do his regular throw without holding the buttons. I'm thinking maybe in certain matchups, Waldstein, because his hitboxes are so big, because his arms are so long, maybe in some matchups you actually would want to throw them further away with the regular universal throw, because if you just do the regular universal throw without holding the buttons, he throws the opponent away from him. So as I'm saying, in certain matchups against people who can't zone him or outrange him, maybe you would want to throw the opponent far away, so then you could zone them with your big buttons, right? Also, I'd have to go back and watch my footage to see exactly what the nuance about this was, but if you hold down the buttons, you side switch, but not if your opponent is all the way in the corner. If your opponent is all the way in the corner, you won't side switch with them. But if your opponent is in the corner but not fully backed up into the corner and you do the held buttons, I think you end up on the opposite side, which would put yourself in the corner. So in cases like that, you would not want to do the held buttons. But that's a very specific part of the map. And everywhere else, you would just want to hold the buttons to get the extra damage, right? So I don't know what the idea behind that was. I'm going to have to experiment more with it when the game actually comes out. The reason why I'm saying that is because I actually did not play Waldstein in this beta test, aside from labbing these new moves, right? I labbed it for, well, I didn't even really lab it. I just went into the lab and checked out the new moves. That I wouldn't consider that labbing. But the reason I'm talking about it like this is because even though I did play a lot of the beta test, I did not play Wald against the actual human players or even the CPU opponent, because I actually wanted to spend the majority of the time in this beta test playing one of the new characters. I don't really remember what I've said so far, but basically what was new in this beta test compared to the previous game is that, for one, it has rollback netcode, okay? It has new moves for every character, some tweaks to the grid gauge and that forward-moving evasive mechanic I said. But it also comes with 2 new characters, 2 of the 3 new characters that will be playable when the game releases. So the 3 new characters are Kuon, Kaguya, and Tsurugi. Kuon being the character that was not playable in this beta test. I would assume that Kuon is already finished, especially because this game uses 2D sprites, right? And so these things take a long time to make. And so I doubt they would be cutting it this close to release with the game releasing in January. I think it's because I think the reason why he's not playable is because I think he's supposed to be this final boss type character in terms of the game's story. And so they might just want to be saving him to build him up more as the villain. But Kaguya and Tsurugi were the 2 new playable characters in this beta test. And because I knew that this game wasn't too different from the previous game, I had correctly predicted that I wouldn't really have much to say about the game design itself. And so, knowing that I would probably want to make some kind of review video talking about the beta, I wanted to have more stuff to say than just, yeah, the rollback was working and the game is barely changed, right? So I wanted to actually spend time playing one of the new characters so I could spend a portion of the video talking about said new characters. So the one I chose to play was Tsurugi, because out of the 3 new characters, out of Kuon, Kaguya, and Tsurugi was the one that interested me the most, because Kaguya uses pistols, and I don't really want to be a zoner, even though she kind of ended up not being fully a zoner, which I can get to later. And Kuon seems as if he would be some zoner scum as well. So I picked Tsurugi, the shield guy, which is kind of funny because the name Tsurugi actually means sword. So I don't know if this is supposed to be an ironic thing with him having a shield as his weapon of choice, even though his name means sword, or maybe it's not supposed to be ironic. Maybe his name is supposed to be complementary to the shield, as in sword and shield, right? Sword and shields go together. Anyways, that's just a bit of useless trivia. I don't even remember where I was. This is an unscripted video, by the way, so some of this stuff might be out of order. I have some notes written down, but they're not in any particular order, and I've already gone over some of them in no particular order either. But I actually ended up really liking Tsurugi because not only does he have a command grab, which made me automatically like him, but overall, he is just a really well-designed and fun fighting game character, and specifically, I think his level of complexity is just right. It is in that perfect Goldilocks zone, at least in terms of my personal tastes, because he's just complex enough to stay interesting and have interesting routes and confirms, but he's not so complicated that he comes across as gimmicky. He's that perfect balance, and I actually ended up liking him quite a bit. So much so that when the game actually comes out, I might actually be a little torn between sticking with him or going back to Waldstein. But I think I'm going to end up going back to Waldstein, and I might keep Tsurugi as a pocket pick. But he's a really fun, well-designed character, and I really don't have any complaints about him at all. His one weakness seems to be that even though he technically does have overheads that can go into combos, he does seem to struggle a little bit in terms of opening opponents up just compared to other characters in the roster. You just have to put in a little bit more work when it comes to opening people up with his offense. But that is kind of to be expected, right? Because he has a big shield as a weapon, so his strength is obviously going to be in defense. And also, some of his buttons are kind of stubby, which makes some of the matchups pretty polarizing, namely Hilda. I already had a hard enough time fighting Hilda as Waldstein because that was just a typical grappler versus premier zoner matchup. But at least in Underknight's case, the premier grappler in Waldstein has really big buttons. And Waldstein can actually destroy projectiles with his claws, and he can also throw a big rock as his force function. And that balances out the matchup a little bit, whereas Tsurugi doesn't have any kind of projectile. He can't throw a rock like Waldstein, and his limbs are much shorter than Waldstein's because Tsurugi, aside from the shield, is just a normally proportioned dude. He's just a guy. So some of his matchups might be a little polarizing, and it does feel as if it takes some more work to open people up compared to playing other characters. But I think that's just fine because every character is going to have some weaknesses. I think when you have a character that has no weaknesses, that actually makes the character boring, because I actually find it fun to play around characters' weaknesses. So anyways, that is my opinion on Tsurugi. I think he's a really well-designed character. I hope they don't really change anything about him when the game releases. I think if they were to buff him at all, I don't think he necessarily needs to be buffed, but if they were to buff him, I could see them maybe changing the frame data on his overhead if you hold the button, because you can hold the button to delay the overhead, but then there was no frame data available in the training mode of this beta test, okay? But you could just have the opponent jump, right? And so I did that as the old school method of testing to see how safe or unsafe or how plus or minus something was. And I noticed, maybe it's a placebo, but I'm pretty sure I noticed that if you hold down the overhead, which was a command normal, if you hold down the overhead command normal, it changes the frame data to be a little bit better. It's still minus, but I think it makes it safe. So if they do end up buffing him, I could definitely see them maybe turning the held overhead to be plus instead of just safe while being minus, because it is so reactable if you hold it down. I think that if you do manage to hit somebody's block from holding it down, maybe you should be rewarded with plus frames. And also his crouching C has a guard point if you hold down the button. But a lot of times in a lot of these matchups, it felt as if the guard point was just a few frames too late to actually be useful. So I could see them maybe having the guard point become active just a few frames earlier. Not that I necessarily think he needs to be buffed. These are just my predictions of what they would change if they do buff him. So I played Tsurugi, like I said, but I did not play Kaguya, who was the other new character. Although I did play against a lot of them. And as you heard me allude to earlier, I was actually expecting her to be just a big zoner, just a zoner supreme, considering she's using dual pistols, right? So naturally, a lot of people would assume, I'm sure you guys assumed she would be a zoner as well, right? And she does have some zoning. She does have a full screen move with a full screen hitbox that she can use to hit confirm into a full damage combo, which is pretty crazy if you ask me. So in that sense, she does have zoning, but overall, I don't know if I would explicitly call her a zoner, because even though her zoning is really strong in that it can confirm into big damage, her zoning options are very limited outside of that one full screen move. So she has a follow-up. She would do this big full screen attack, and then she would do a follow-up. I don't know if that was necessarily part of the same move or if she was just often using the other move after it. But anyways, my point is that she only has 1 or 2 or 3 zoning moves, so she doesn't have a lot of different attack vectors for her zoning, like characters such as Batista or Hilda do, right? Because Hilda and Batista actually have a lot of different attack vectors that they can use, attack vectors by which they can threaten zoning attacks. And that, in my opinion, is what makes a zoner an actual zoner, having multiple different attack vectors from far away, right? Whereas Kaguya only has 1 real attack vector from far away. But she makes up for it in terms of her mix-up and her damage and her Oki. So I don't really understand exactly how it worked, but she could send out these little sparklies on the screen. I think she could send out 3 at once, and they would just fly around the screen in a very hard to predict path. I don't know if they were on a set path or if they had some kind of homing capability. I think it might be some combination of both. It starting in some kind of predictable trajectory, and then after an extent, it starts homing onto her opponent. But it was kind of hard to keep track of when fighting Kaguya. And so if she did a setup correctly, or even if it just happened to turn out this way, you would have to wake up into these sparklies as they hit you. And it actually reminded me of the little exploding sparkly thing that Leona could throw out in King of Fighters. You have to wake up into that. So Kaguya's Oki is really strong, and her mix-up is really strong, and she can convert into a full damage combo from full screen. So I think Kaguya is really good, but I don't have much experience, or I don't have any experience being on the actual piloting end of her. So if any of you guys played Kaguya for yourself, I'm actually really interested to hear what your impression of her is. So make sure you leave any thoughts about Kaguya in the comments, because I could have played a little bit of Kaguya, but I really wanted to specifically just focus on Tsurugi because I ended up liking him so much, and I figured other people could talk about Kaguya, especially because Kaguya seemed to be more popular than Tsurugi, which really surprised me. I was actually expecting to fight a lot of Tsurugis over the beta test, but I only actually ended up fighting maybe 2 or 3 of them, which was surprising to me, because the reason why I was expecting him to be so popular is because, for one, he's new, right? So with Kaguya and Tsurugi, I knew Kaguya would be at least a certain level of popular, right? But I was expecting Tsurugi to be even more popular, not only because he was also new, but because he is just pretty easy to use. He's really easy to use. Again, I never played Kaguya, but I imagine I would expect Kaguya to be more complicated to use than Tsurugi, because Tsurugi's inputs and his game plan is pretty straightforward. So when you have a new character that's also easy to use, I think that's usually a recipe for making a pretty popular character. But surprisingly, he was not picked very often. Maybe it's because having a character that just looks like a normal dude comes across as a little boring to some players when the rest of the cast is so weird and crazy, right? But anyways, those are my thoughts on Tsurugi and Kaguya. I'm assuming Kaguya is named after Princess Kaguya from the myth, right? I only felt the need to say that because I was talking about Tsurugi's name, so I wanted to balance it out a little bit. And as for Kuon, I don't know what Kuon actually means, but I do know it is the name of the most rare, the most expensive PS2 game ever. So maybe he is named after the PS2 game. Also, something I forgot to mention when speaking about the rollback is that you can actually manually set your input delay frames, which is great. And that is something that should be available in every game with rollback. I really wish Tekken 8 would let you do this, right? For example, I wish Tekken 8 would let you do this, but really every game, every fighting game with rollback netcode should allow you to manually set your input delay frames. There's really no reason for them to not allow you to do such a thing. Again, like I said earlier, everything about this game performed as designed, and that is why I'm not really critiquing anything. If you watch my other videos, namely my review videos or impression videos, you'll know that I do acknowledge that a lot of my reviews tend to seem negative. They tend to seem as if they lean negative because I typically spend the majority of my time in reviews talking about critiques, talking about negative things instead of talking about the good things. And I acknowledge this because my rationale is that if I am going to go out of my way to critique something, then I feel as if I have a bigger responsibility to articulate myself and explain what is wrong about the things that I dislike than if I am just hyping something up. Because if I'm hyping something up, I can literally just say, it's great, it's fun, go buy it. That is a lot easier to say. But if you are specifically going to critique a piece of artwork, like I said, I feel as if there is a bit more responsibility to articulate your thoughts in such a way that you are justifying your complaining of a thing, right? That isn't to say that this beta test, or that isn't to say that this game isn't going to have some downsides, though, because if you pay attention to my choice of words, I said that everything this game is doing is performing and working as designed. And the reason why I said as designed is because you might be wondering about it. You might have already been thinking about it. The one downside to this game, well, the one real downside to this game when it releases is that it won't have crossplay. That's the one thing hurting this game. It's not going to hurt it as badly as some other games lacking crossplay, when I say other games, I'm specifically thinking about games that are on PC and PlayStation and Xbox, because if a game on all three of those systems were to lack crossplay, that means you are isolating 3 different systems, whereas in this game's case, it is only releasing on PlayStation and Steam. So with this game not having crossplay, it is only segregating the player base between 2 platforms instead of 3, but that is still segregating player bases nonetheless, and it kind of hurts, especially when it comes to a game this niche, because, not having as many players playing the game, they are probably going to eventually coalesce on the PC version, and that makes me worried a bit for the PS4 or PS5/PS4 player base, right? Because it'll eventually become a self-fulfilling prophecy. As more people decide to coalesce on the PC version, then it'll gain a reputation of not having a player base on console, and then less people will play it on console, and less people will buy it on console, right? And that would be a big downside for me, because with my current living situation, I pretty much have to stream multiplayer games only on console. So I hope that the PlayStation version does manage to keep a player base. So aside from that, less significant from the lack of crossplay is that, and this might just be a beta test thing, this might be changed when the game releases, but even though you can manually set your input delay frames, which is great, like I said, in an actual match, even though you can see the ping and you can see the ping variation, it actually does not explicitly say how many frames of rollback you have at any given time. You can definitely estimate it based on your set input delay frames and seeing the ping at the same time. So maybe you could find some kind of formula to calculate it and figure out exactly how many rollback frames you have in any given moment. But just if you want to glance at it while playing, you don't see an actual rollback frame counter, which I think is weird, because even though the netcode was good in all of my matches, theoretically, if you come across a match that doesn't have a good connection, you might want to see what the rollback is in terms of how many rollback frames there are, because that could influence how you want to approach neutral if certain things are going to be harder to react to if you have the opponent teleporting around, right? So I hope that they add a rollback frame counter. It would really take no effort for them to add that, which is why I'm saying it. Also, this might be related to the rollback frames, but I actually had no idea what this was for. So if anybody out there knows what this was for, please let me know in the comments. But if you look at the gameplay footage, down in the bottom right where the ping is displayed and where I would expect the rollback frame counter to be displayed if it were in the game, you can see I think it was in parentheses on the bottom right, the far bottom right. I'm already talking about the bottom right area, but I mean all the way to the bottom right. There is a set of parentheses with a percentage inside of said parentheses. And most of the time it was saying 0%, but I know that I had at least one match in which the percentage was sometimes going up above 0. And I have no idea what that is supposed to indicate. This one match in which I remember seeing the percentage go up did happen to be one of the few matches in which I actually was noticing rollback. So I'm assuming you don't want that percentage to go up. And if this game were cross-playing on PC, then I would probably be assuming that the percentage is a measurement of how much CPU usage my opponent's PC is undergoing, kind of similar to Tekken 8's measurement of if a PC is having trouble, right? Because Tekken 8 does crossplay with PC. But as I said, this game does not have crossplay, so I have no idea what that percentage could be actually indicating. So if anybody knows, please say it in the comments so I can finally understand what that percentage means. And also, again, this could just be me not understanding something, but in the queues, oh, by the way, in this beta test, if you look at the footage, if you watch some B-roll footage, if I put B-roll footage up, I'm going to edit out the time in between matches, or in between sets, I should say. I would edit out the time in which I just wait in the queue. But if you go and watch other people's videos and you see them waiting a long time in the queue, don't take that to mean that there was barely anybody playing this game, because for some reason in this beta test, they allowed, when I say they, I mean the publisher, allowed players to infinitely rematch in the casual matchmaking, which was the only matchmaking available in this beta. That's why you see everybody is ranked D4 or whatever. But they allowed infinite rematch, which is very peculiar, because even though infinite rematch is great, it's strange to have that in a beta test in which they are presumably testing the netcode, right? Because infinite rematch is going to allow you to keep on playing the same opponent over and over. And so overall, given a set amount of time, it means you are going to fight less total amount of different opponents in general, right? Which means they have less data to sift through. It means they have less data in terms of different players fighting different players. And also with people being able to infinitely rematch each other, it means you are going to keep people out of the queue. So if you see people sitting around in the queue waiting for a match, it doesn't mean that nobody's playing the game, because in reality, a lot of people are playing the game, but they are just infinitely rematching an opponent that they already found several minutes ago or even further ago, right? And you're just waiting for somebody to get out of an infinite rematch. So don't assume that barely anybody was playing this. And the reason I say that is because if you assume nobody was playing it, you might think, oh, there's barely any interest in this game. If so few people are playing the game already right before the game releases, then that means nobody's going to be playing the game a few months after launch. So don't interpret it that way, right? There were definitely people playing this game. The only reason the queues were longer is because for some reason they allowed infinite rematch. Maybe it's because they were confident enough about the netcode that they didn't feel as if they needed to test even more different connections, right? Because Melty Blood type Lumina has rollback, and the rollback in that game is very good. And I imagine the actual structure of the code is very similar in this game as it is to Melty Blood. But anyway, I had to mention that. Oh, the whole reason I was bringing that up is the whole reason I was bringing up the queues is because I was getting on to my other potential critique. So similar to the lack of rollback frame display potentially being something I'm just missing if it is somehow related to the percentage that I don't understand. When you are in the queue and you find an opponent, I don't see any kind of Wi-Fi indicator anywhere. You can see the ping, obviously, and you can see the ping variation, as you can still see when a match starts. But I looked around and I couldn't find any kind of indicator that would imply if your opponent is on Wi-Fi or wired. I do see a little icon by the bars. The bars seem a little unnecessary to me because you would just look at the ping to get a more accurate impression of what the connection is like rather than looking at the bars, whether it be 3 bars or 4 bars or whatever. But by said bars, there was a little icon, and that icon potentially could be the indicator for wired or Wi-Fi. But in terms of all the opponents I found, that icon was always the same. So potentially, if it is an indicator for wired or Wi-Fi, that means that maybe everybody I fought happened to be on wired, which maybe is also why I have a really good impression of the netcode. Because I would argue for a more niche, for a more obscure fighting game, such as Under Night in Birth Celes, the player base is going to have a much larger percentage of people playing on wired than a game with a lot of casual players, such as Mortal Kombat, right? So maybe I'm a little biased in favor of the netcode just because the people I played with are people, or the majority of people I played with are likely people that tend to value having a good connection more so than your average Mortal Kombat player, right? So anyway, those are the only negatives about the game. No crossplay, which is an actual significant critique, and less significant is that there's no actual display on the number of rollback frames. The reason why that is less significant is because you can still see the ping and you can estimate how much rollbackage there is. And also, I don't know if it explicitly says if there is a wired connection or a Wi-Fi connection when you see an opponent, but if you just leave it on that screen for a few seconds before hitting accept, you could probably estimate pretty accurately if your opponent is on Wi-Fi or not, just based on what the ping is doing, right? Just based on how much the ping is varying. But I think that is all I have to say about the Under Night 2 beta specifically. Again, I really like the design of the game. I have no complaints about the actual design itself. Also, I forgot to mention this, and I didn't realize this on the first day because on the first day, I specifically just wanted to hear the new songs, the new character themes in Tsurugi's theme and Kaguya's theme. Oh, also, I forgot to mention before when talking about the new stuff, there is a new stage here. But for the first day, I mostly just wanted to listen to Kaguya's theme and Tsurugi's theme because those are completely new tracks, right? And so I didn't realize it at first, but I realized it after the first day of just listening to those themes. But all of the returning songs, all of the returning character themes from the previous game, they have new elements to the songs. So some of the returning songs are changed a bit more significantly than other songs. Probably because the actual creators consider some of the songs to be better than others. And so if a song is already perfect, you really don't need to change it much. Whereas maybe they thought some of the other songs needed a bit more work. But for example, some of the songs just added a guitar solo. As for me, that's something I really appreciated, and I didn't see many people talking about it. Like I said, I didn't even know this was a thing at first until I was actually hearing the themes. And keep in mind, even though I did play Unist, even though I did play Under Night Late Est or EXE Late Est about a week before this beta test to warm up for the game, before that warm-up sesh, I actually hadn't played Under Night for about maybe 2 or 3 years. I played it about 2 or 3 years ago, and I just played it for a few weeks. And even then, I had a really high impression of the game, a really good impression of the game, thinking that the design was pretty much perfect, but I just didn't stick with it because I think I was focusing on Soul Calibur at the time. So my point is that I hadn't heard a lot of these themes for over like 2 or 3 years, but even so, I remembered the themes really well because the music in this game, the music in the Under Night games in general, is really good. And so I could remember how good the themes were, and I remembered the actual composition. So in this beta test, when I heard the new elements, it made me think, wait, hold on, did they change it? So I actually, just to check, just to make sure I wasn't misremembering the songs, I went on YouTube and listened to the original themes to compare them to the new themes. And yes, the new themes do in fact have some changes and new elements in them, which is really cool. And if you're into the music in games, you would appreciate this sort of thing. I imagine most people who like fighting games are really into music as well, right? Unless you exclusively play Mortal Kombat, in which case maybe you don't care about music too much. Not to knock on Mortal Kombat too hard though, because I actually think MK1's music is a lot better than MK11's or MKX's. But anyway, let me know what you guys think. Let me know what you thought about the beta. If you played it or if you didn't play the beta, well, I don't know why you would be watching a video like this if you didn't play the beta, because it was an open beta test, which means anybody would be able to play it. It's not like Tekken 8's case in which it was a closed beta test in which you had people watching reviews that wanted to get in but couldn't. But regardless of the reason, regardless of why you guys might be watching this video, let me know if you have any questions, and you would put those questions in the comments, right? That's how you would let me know about the questions, obviously. So thanks for watching, everyone, and bye for now.